Hey folks, it's Sandy with Guitar Interactive Magazine, and in this Making Tracks I'm going to have a go at answering a question that seems to crop up an awful lot out on sort of various online forums and recording groups, and that's about how loud to record things. So it's a question that's kind of very simple to ask, but actually has a little bit more to it once you get down to it. So I'm going to break it down into maybe three sort of slightly different parts. So the first part has got to be about how actually loud things are. Now, the sound that we hear is caused by variations in pressure in the air, and louder sounds have greater variations in the pressure. So taking the question of how loud to record, and let's say for a minute that we're recording something with a microphone, so we've got something that's a real source that's making real sound in a room, as against say an electronic instrument which is simply generating a signal. So how loud should the source be? There are two things that affect this. One is noise, and one is the actual timbre, the actual sound of the instrument. So noise, everything makes noise. A room with nothing going on in it has a noise level to it. And the quieter the source, the thing that we're trying to record, the further it sort of sinks down towards the noise floor of the room. Now that's typically okay, that the room noise isn't particularly obtrusive as we normally hear it. But if we take a really quiet source and then we have to amplify it to get it to a level that we want it in our recording, as well as amplifying the thing that we want, we amplify all the background noise as well. And it's possible that we can actually get to the point where that background noise becomes quite obtrusive. So the first thing about how loud the source should be is that it needs to be sufficiently loud that we can hear it clearly without having to boost it unnaturally that brings up the background noise. Now, people sometimes think, oh, well, that's okay. If I'm recording something and it's quiet, I just turn my preamp up. And yet, when you do that, that's when you bring up all the noise in the room, you bring up the noise. Microphones, even when they're not picking up anything external, make noise. Even cables make noise. Electrons banging into each other in a conductor generates bits of noise. So the louder the source is compared with everything else around it, the better the signal to noise ratio is going to be and the easier it's going to be to deal with. So obviously staying within the limits of what your microphone and what your preamps will cope with without them overloading, without them clipping, without them distorting. In that sense, louder is better. Now, we can't always go as loud as we want to. A lot of us have to work with neighbours, with other people around. But as far as you can get away with it, louder is generally better as far as noise is concerned, or as far as signal versus noise is concerned. Now, the other thing that probably matters more most of the time is the actual tone of what we're after. And simply put, things tend to sound different when they're loud. And the classic one that we all know about is take a valve guitar amp. And just as an example, if we listen to this, and then we listen to this, so even when we listen back to that with the levels balanced out, you can hear that the louder version of the amp sounds an awful lot better. It's thicker, it's richer, it's more solid than the version which is turned down to virtually zero. Yes, it's quite loud in the room, but if you are recording that amp, that's the sort of level that you need to be at to actually get it to sound good. Okay, the next thing to think about is once you've actually got the sound hitting the microphone, you need to make sure that you've got a suitable microphone that's not going to clip and overload in its own circuitry. You need a preamp that's got enough headroom that your microphone isn't going to be overdriving the preamp unless you want to do that for effect. And this is a recurring theme with this. So some microphones will have a pad switch on, some won't. Some preamps have a pad switch on. With your preamps and with anything else, any other hardware devices that you've got before you go into your audio interface, before you turn your electrical signal into digital data, the things to be aware of is that most devices are made to operate within a certain kind of range where they are clean and they're quiet and they've got, you know, good linear operation. They don't distort, they don't add or take away things from your sound. Now, you may creatively want to abuse that. You know, quite famously, things like API and Neve preamps can sound very nice when you actually push them and get a little bit of grind going on in there. But the real sort of clue, I think, to doing this is you can look at the specs and you can figure out what you need to be doing, but most things have got some sort of metering on, even if it's just a clip LED. Keep an eye on your LEDs, make sure you're not clipping, and basically check each bit of hardware as you go along to make sure that you're not getting gain creeping up from one thing to the next to the point where the last thing in chain is getting its input overdriven horribly. So just keep an eye and make sure that you are within the headroom of the analog chain that you've got, and also just keep an ear on things to make sure that if you are deliberately distorting and pushing things a bit, that you're not adding distortion onto distortion onto distortion and ending up kind of losing the essence of what you started off with. Again, unless that's what you're after. Right, for the next step, we're going to take our analog signals and turn them into digital data. And the thing that does this is the ADC, the analog to digital converter. So it's going to take the voltages that we've dealt with so far, and it's going to turn them into what we call words of data. Now, when you record, you hear about things which might be 16-bit or 24-bit, and the bits are binary digits, which basically are numbers which can be only 1 or 0. And the 16 and 24 is how many of them you've got in a thing called a word. You don't need to worry too much about that, except to know that when your ADC writes a word which is all zeros, 0, 0, 0, 0, all the way across, that's as quiet as it gets. That is just nothing. That is going to have nothing but digital noise to it. When it writes a word which is all ones, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, all the way across, that is the loudest thing that you can possibly record. Now, the zeros bit, the bit where it's really quiet, we don't tend to worry about too much of the time, but the bit where it's all ones is really, really important. And the reason is this. Back in the good old days, you'd be recording onto tape. And a couple of things about tape. One is that it sounds good, and the other is that it's actually quite noisy. So it became the practice to push the levels up. And by pushing the levels up, you get a greater signal to noise ratio. Remember, like we talked about with the levels in the room. And if those peaks started to get too hot for what the tape could cope with, they would round off in a really pleasing way. So you get this tape saturation effect. You get a good level onto the tape, which pushes the noise floor down, and everybody's happy. That idea kind of sticks with what people originally thought they should be doing in the digital world. The trouble is that in the digital world, you're recording these words of data. Remember, the ones and the zeros. And when you get a word which is made up of all ones, that's it. It's not an average level with headroom above it. It's the absolute utter loudest you can get. The reason that this is a problem is that if your converter takes your signal and converts just one word of it into all ones, you have got no way of knowing if that's the actual level, if you just peaked, hit that level and dropped down from it, or if you carried on sailing past it and lost a load of data about how loud it's supposed to be. If you've got a number of words written like that, you've got no idea how they're supposed to relate to each other or indeed what level they're meant to be at. And if you get enough of them to hear, generally held to be something like 3 sort of successive samples, you get sounds which sound, in most cases, pretty horrible. It's referred to as digital clipping, and unlike analog clipping, you know, unlike sort of tape and valve and things like this, it really doesn't tend to sound very nice at all. So what do? The answer is, on the meters that are attached to your converters, you make sure that you never ever hit 0 dB FS. FS full scale as high as it can go. Now, recording is one of those things that once you've actually got your levels set up, you can never know quite what's going to happen in a performance. So you need to leave a little bit of headroom. And what I tend to recommend is this. Do a sample, do a test recording, and on the loudest bits, make sure that you've got somewhere between 6 and 10 dB on the meters attached to your converters of headroom above the loudest peaks, not the average levels, the loudest peaks. If you're doing that, then you're never going to clip in theory. You're going to be absolutely fine. What you do later on in mixing and mastering, you can change the levels as much as you want there. That's controlled. But for recording, leave plenty of headroom. Now, if we think back to what we're saying people used to do in the analog world, you'd got a meter which showed 0 dB and then had 20 dB of headroom above it. And yes, you could let the meters dip into the red and that was absolutely fine. So what I will quite often do when I'm recording is I'll actually pull up a plug-in of a VU meter and I'll have that calibrated so 0 dB VU is the same as a minus 20 dB full scale. And that means that when my meters are ticking away at around about the 0 mark, I've got the classic 20 dB of headroom above it. Now, if this means that your peaks are coming in at minus 10, something like that, it really doesn't matter. A 24-bit system is going to give over 100 dB of dynamic range between the noise floor of the digital system and the loudest you can get, which is that word full of ones. The digital system itself makes an amount of noise and you want to keep your signal up above that. But in the real world, the background noise of your recording, so the sound of your room that we talked about, the sound that's generated by your microphone itself, by your preamp, by anything analog that you've got in front of your digital converters, is probably going to swamp that level anyway. So really do not worry about it. It's not a concern in most of the real world. So if you are recording with the average levels, hitting minus 20 dB, 20 dB of headroom above should be absolutely ample for, the loudest of peaks without worrying about clipping it. The noise floor is going to be low enough that you just really do not need to worry about it. And then you can just get on and record. So the how loud question, just to break that down and summarize it, for the source, make sure that the source is loud enough, that it's clear above the background noise, and that it's in the zone where it's sounding good. So if you need to crank an amp up, get the amp cranked up. If you've got a singer who needs to belt, let the singer belt. If you're hitting an acoustic guitar and you want to get that kind of acoustic compression that comes in with it, the thing gets louder when you hit it loud, just get the sound that you want to capture. That's the most important thing to start off with. Make sure that your recording gear is able to cope with that, so that you've got microphones that will cope with the loud, that you've got preamps that will cope with the loud. Anything analog that you've got in your signal path, make sure that you've got decent gain staging on that. Use the clip indicators, use the meters, and use your ears to make sure that you're not just sort of driving things away from where you want it to be. And then when you hit your digital converters, set your average to record at round about minus 20 dB full scale. That should be leaving you, say, 6 to 10 dB headroom above that level, and then you can just get on with capturing the performance, which is what it's all about, really. Okay, hope that's of some use to you. I think I'm going to stick with the Q&A format for making tracks for a little while, because there are a lot of questions that keep cropping up. So please, contact details are in the article. Drop me a line, let me know what you'd like to see and hear covered, and I would love to do that for you. Okay, this is Andy, this is Guitar Interactive Magazine. Take care, and I will catch up with you soon. Bye now.